Hey guys, and welcome to Viewing a Brew with Gaz. Welcome back to part 2. Today we'll be working on the vehicle for the 251 Half-Track. This is one of the Battlefront Miniatures, as we stated in the first video, and is one of the favourites of the Germans, especially the Panzer Grenadiers, in the late war. As you can see, there's lots of good detail on this, but there's also some areas we won't need to paint. On the top chassis we have the gun plate at the front, as well as an MG42 at the rear. This could have been used by the crew that was currently in the vehicle, or any troops being moved around by it. This plate at the front is the cut-off for where I'll need to paint up to. As once fitted, it blocks off the front section. We'll just leave that area and concentrate on rearwards of that point. I love the two little seats in the front and the slatted wooden sections in the back. It's a really nice Mini. The first colour we'll be applying is Citadel Layer USHABTI Bone. I've thinned this down with quite a bit of water. Essentially we'll break it down by painting each part individually. So I'm going to start with the top chassis. As I apply it, you can see we've kept it quite thin. The reason for this is just a bit more control. You can go with a bigger brush and really, lash around with this and get it all over the model quite quickly. But I wanted a nice thin layer, and I wanted to make sure that I avoided stuff like the MG42 at the back. That way I don't have to do any repair work later. Moving on to the lower chassis, we'll be working around these flat edges and surfaces to the side. I'm not sure if these were stowage bins or not, but we can also work on the wheels. My idea for this is to use the three colours I'm using for the camouflage, alternating down the wheel pattern on the side. I say wheels, it's actually the gears that drive the track at the rear, but the only wheels really on it are the ones at the front. So let's get that started. With the colour all the way around, you can see what I was talking about now with the wheel sections and the drives. We will be washing it up, and I'm sure you'll see that with a wash it actually really starts to come together. That front section we talked about, you can see I've gone up to a certain point so it's overlapped, but not actually painted out the whole front assembly, and once fitted, of line of sight. So let's move on. Citadel Shade Agrax Earthshade is what I'll be using across the whole of the model to bring out those detail lines, such as the creases and the rivets. I've thinned this down about 2:1, so 1 part water, 2 parts paint. This allows it to flow really easy, but still sit in those gaps. I'm likely to apply more than one coat of this over the course of painting the camouflage. So this first layer is an initial one just to tone it down and take it away from that desert look and bring it more into what would be a European theatre mid-war. Always remove the excess where you can. The lower chassis has some doors at the rear, which will hold the colour detail really well. So I concentrate on making sure that the ink goes into those areas and move it around on the flat spots. I do love the details of these models and work hard to use this ink to show the recesses, get some shadowing on there, but not so much that it sort of drowns everything out. Along the sides we have these sort of stowage areas or side bins from the look of it. I'm not 100% on what they are, but I really like the depth of the detail. It gives a lovely surface for the ink really to hold into. But again, keeping in mind we'll be doing a second one, I don't want them to completely black out. So removing the excess and making sure the edges are done is quite important. With that layer done, you can really see how the models come to life. There's definitely a lot more detail that was hidden without the wash. I love the plating in the back on the floor. gives a clear indication. It's like an anti-slip in there. And overall, I'm very happy with how this looks and would quite happily put it into North Africa. But North Africa's not where this model will be going, so Citadel layer Vulkan green is how we move on with the camouflage. The idea with this pattern that I'll be applying is for it to sort of be clumps of foliage, tree branches, and then the lighter spots will be the sort of the gaps in the trees. I doubt this is one that is actually used in the Second World War. It's something I kind of came together myself because I really like the three colours. I tried the P scheme, but it didn't quite work for me. So basically I just let go with it a little bit. I read up that quite a few tank commanders would change the camouflage once they were up and about if the vehicle had took damage, and they applied what they could where they could in a pattern they thought would be best for their vehicle. I mean, aircraft are going to spot these pretty easily due to hard lines unless you get a good camo setup. Looking at it now, you can see we've almost got some striping, but it's definitely not even. It's broken up a little bit. And when it comes to the top chassis at the front, we've really gone to town on not having evenly distributed lines and patterns. It's very blotchy, but it should come together later. We finish out with the wheels and the drive cogs again. Looking at it overall now, I'm quite happy that we've got sort of an even spacing, nothing's too clumped, and I've got a little bit of work between. Again, we're alternating the colour pattern down the sides of the wheels. It's just easier that way for me, rather than trying to put the pattern onto such a small surface. For the next stage of the camo pattern, we'll be using Citadel layer Doom Bull Brown. So the aim here is to pretty much run a line in the centre area of the gaps that we currently have between the greens. Again, this is the idea of having branches and such that would give some form of camouflage. I've used this method before and I really quite like the final look. I'm sure that you could get the correct colour schemes. Obviously I'm using Citadel here, but there's plenty of different ranges that mix their colours specifically for World War II, such as Vallejo and many others out there. You can even buy box sets now as well. So with the brown applied, it looks quite striking. Essentially all we've done is what we did with the green, just moving around the model and keeping it in the gaps. Looks kind of bright at the minute, which is kind of off-putting. And again, we've done the cogs on the track section for the final alternating colour. We'll work on the tracks later, but you can see that it's kind of worked, I hope. Moving on to some of the details, I pick up Citadel Colour Contrast Black Templar. If you've watched some of my other videos, I bet you can guess a couple of things I'll be doing with this. I start off with the tyres at the front. I did think about using Basilicanum Grey, but it's kind of pale once it's dry, and I wanted the tyres to have a real robust black, so this was the obvious choice. I'm careful, but I'll finish off the actual rim of the wheel with a small brush. Here's the bit I bet a few of you probably guessed I was going to move on to. I love this colour for doing on weapon systems, so the MG42 was an obvious choice. I gradually just push it around the model, making sure that I remove any excess off the sides so I get some good depth of colour. It also generates a lot of the light and shadow for me. Again, this is why it's one of my favourites. And it always seems to give me a good finish, or at least a good start point to then move on and highlight. In addition to the gun, I needed to put something on the seats. I had done quite a bit of research for the museums and such to see what the current build ones were like inside. Some had padded sections in the back, some had padded sections on the seats, but black was an easy option for us. With those done and the colours already fitted, you can see that it's actually coming together quite nicely. Carrying on with the details, I'll move on to Citadel Colour Contrast Wildwood. Again, I really like this colour. It was often found that these seat sections at the back are made of a light wood. Some were dark wood that I've seen in the museums again, but not all of them, so there was a bit of a mix, and I do wonder if it was just a case of, with the war, they couldn't always get the access that they needed to the same wood types. So we're going to apply this on and keep it fairly thin, but I'm very conscious of trying to get it into all those shadows. As I was working through this section, I'm starting to notice some of the details that are in the back. There's a couple of bolts on the rear door that I'll probably address later on. The seat itself has sections that run down towards the floor. I imagine that these would have been the yellow that the overall sort of the USHABTI bone colour is that we've done with the rest of the chassis. But having already moved on from that, I decided just to continue and brown out those sections as well. It'll give some shadow at least to the area. I really do love this floor pattern. The sort of anti-slip, corrugated iron look is really nice, and something I definitely want to work on a little bit. It's put a bit of wear and tear inside the vehicle as the troops and the crews get in and out of it on a regular basis. I can also imagine them dragging the old ammo boxes, throwing them into the back and sliding them along when it came to personal equipment and to the MG42s that were mounted to this little beast. It puts out a lot of firepower considering, even though it's an open-top vehicle in-game and is a little more susceptible to fire, it certainly can give some damage out when it comes to infantry. The seats came out really nice. I tried to keep the shadows towards the edges. Having noticed those details, I now come back to Citadel Colour Contrast Black Templar. I decided to go with this on the sort of the locking mechanism for the rear doors. It's likely we're the same colour, or they might have even been a silvery metal, but you want to pick out some of the details, you want to make them stand out. And obviously the contrast Templar black will really set them dark against the lightness of the colour scheme around them. So it's just a little bit of effort to try and make them stand out. With that done, I move on to a Citadel Layer Iron Breaker. Yeah, this is kind of my go-to when it comes to building up silvers. The front axle, although barely seeable? I don't even think that's true. Barely visible, maybe. Needed a bit of love. So we just darkened it down with a single layer of Iron Breaker so that at certain angles it just wouldn't stand out. This is the first stage of what I'll be doing on the tracks. Again, I love the detail of these tracks. The gaps and the center points for each of the track links is really clearly defined and gives you a lot to work with. It's very pleasing to work on models like this. I went my way all the way around the tracks, making sure that some of the light spots I've got at the back are fully covered. Once happy, I move on to other areas and do a final check of everything to make sure it all looks good and that I've not made any obvious mistakes or missed any particular areas. I think I've got it all, so pretty happy. We talked about that plating on the floor in the back. At this point I decided to take some of the lead belcher and just apply a very light dry brush. I wanted to see how it looked, so I'm not looking to do complete coverage as much as just break up the surface area a little bit and have some silvering shining through. I even rub a bit off with a finger when I think I've got a little too much. I build it up slowly with a couple of layers and I think it works out really well. Next up we have Citadel Layer Doom Brown. Yes, I did say that wrong. One of the things that was bugging me as I was handling the model was the underneath carriage being completely black. So I know one of the prime colours that they would use for many of the armoured vehicles and such was similar to this. With that in mind, I go back in now with the Doom Brown, yes, I managed to get it right this time, and give it a layer underneath as if it had the primer applied from manufacture. Obviously this would be important to protect the vehicle, but for me, yes, it's just a little thing, nobody will pretty much see it, but I do like the model better this way. For our next phase on the tracks, we'll go to Citadel Shade NULN Oil. Having established the lead belcher already, this is what I'm going to do to re-establish some of the depth and details. So those lines between the tracks and those pocket points that are on the outer edge will sort of pop again. It seems like it might be a waste of time to have done the first layer, but this is a thinned down layer of shade and will give good coverage and allow some of the silvers to shine through. Up next, we've got Ammo MIG Acrylic Colour Brush and Airbrush Rust Effect. Look at that, it comes with a stirring ball inside. So this is one of my favourite tools for rusting. You apply a little bit of it here and there, and once it's dry, it gives you initial brown, but it lightens as it dries, should I say. So your final judgment on this will be once it's had the extra time to establish the final colour. I quite like it, I must admit. Just some bit of rusting here and there for the track assembly. Now we go back to Citadel Shade Agrax Earthshade. You find yourself moving back and forth between the colours, that's to allow them to dry. Earlier I said I'd likely use this as a second layer, and here we are now applying that. This time though it's a 50-50 mix with the water, so it's a really light shading. Once I'm happy that the upper surface is all covered, I transition to the lower chassis. I love this stuff when it comes to putting a layer onto the USHABTI bone. You can see in the wheel well at the front how easily it takes up the detail. Moving backwards across the cog sections for the track, they have a lot of depth detail, the circular holes and such. So I work hard putting extra layers of the shade in to make sure that these are prominent and easily seen. With that done, I move back to the chassis. I'm also conscious here of keeping the layers to a point where they don't saturate. So again, we're removing any from the surface, but making great efforts to put them into the recesses. This will be the last layer of the shade we use, so I want to get it right. And I need to undershadow as well. And now we're back to where we started, with Citadel layer USHABTI bone. For this final phase on the armour, I'll be dry brushing. I apply some of the paint to the small brush, this one's specifically for dry brushing. Remove most of the excess on the piece of tissue, and then proceed to apply it to the vehicle itself. As you can see, I started with the under chassis at the back to make sure I had the right sort of mix, as that would have been an easy area to repair and out of the line of sight in case it got to a point where I couldn't easily repair it. Working my way around, I use the brush just to catch all the edges and any of the details. On the upper chassis we do exactly the same. So at this point we've done all the under chassis that had the camo pattern on, and we've done all the track cogs that were on the tracks as well. Again, as I've transitioned and put some more paint onto the brush, I start at the lowest point at the forward edge, as it would be an easy place to repair. You kind of just keep going and building up. The danger is putting too much on the brush, and it's very easy to do that. But if you keep working on the tissue until you can't really see anything coming off, you'll be surprised how much more you can start brush. I also try and use only the tips of the brush. You can see it only comes up to maybe halfway, and that's so that I don't get any loaded into the body of the brush and put a horrible big splodge somewhere. You can see looking at it now that the colours are a lot more muted and toned. It does seem like it's been sun bleached. This is also very useful for forming like a dust effect onto the wheels. You can do this with pigments, and there are lots of stuff on the market now, a couple of which I actually have. But at this point, this will do just as good a job. The joy of the track sections at the back is, because we've used it as a dry brush through the centre cog sections, they already look like they're fairly dusty. So just working around the tyre, making sure I catch the eggs. So I give it a last look over. I want to make sure it's fairly even in how we've done the dry brushing. No single colours stand out. With that done, I take the driver that we painted in part 1 and place him into his position. I'm really gutted that most of this won't be seen, if I'm honest. I love this guy. These half-bodied miniatures are so good, but we'll pretty much only see the back. He seems pretty comfy in there though, so I'm quite happy with that. This is kind of one of the tools I love to use, and it seems silly. It's a really cheap, nasty eBay special. I bought a set of file fittings for it. It takes AA batteries. I use it for mold line removal, and I use it to scuff up the surfaces of paint and to remove stuff for better bonds. Looking around this edge, I can see, having placed the upper chassis onto the lower chassis, that these points are all going to be glued into position. And pretty much all of them have got some form of paint on, be it the primer layer or the follow-up paint that we've put on to do the colour schemes. You can easily do most of this with a craft knife. The big thing with having this tool is, because of its shape, not only can it do flat surfaces, but it works really well in recesses without skinning away too much of the model's material and losing definition in things like clothing and cloaks. So yes, it's cheap. Yes, I buy them at 3 or 4 a time because they last maybe 3 or 4 months, but wow, does it give you a big advantage when removing bad mold lines. So with the final layers done and the glue in position, we stuck on the top part of the chassis to the bottom. In addition, I've also put the gunner in. You kind of get a feel now for the whole model. It's got muted tones on the outside, very clean painting lines on the inside, and all that's left really is this equipment at the front. We seem to have what looks like some form of jack assembly and sort of a pickaxe on the other side. So let's have a look at doing them. To start with, I'll be using Citadel Colour Contrast Wildwood. Yes, you guessed it, it's for the wood. So I'm just going to do what we did in the back on the slatted section, so keep the colours all tied together. For the metals, we'll be using Citadel Layer Iron Breaker. Again, this is kind of a tried and tested method for me, so I'll be consistently doing stuff like this across the models that I paint. We're just going to pick out the metal details at the head of the pickaxe, and the assembly on the other side looks like it's something that would be all metal, so I'll spend a bit more time on that one, establishing a base layer to work up from. You could really do it from that colour there, go straight to doing some washes and then do a final layer of lead belch. To highlight the wildwood, we'll be using Citadel Layer SKRAG Brown. This is a straightforward coverage. Just looking to do the top section, bring up the colour a little bit, make it pop a little more out of the chassis and not be quite so dark. So nothing complicated here, just a quick highlight. For shading, we'll be using Citadel Shade NULN oil on the metal components. As I said before, now that we've allowed the first layer to dry and it's established, I'll now go over it with the NULN oil. This is kind of my method every time. Finally, we'll re-highlight it with Citadel Layer Iron Breaker, which was our start point. I'm careful here not to completely cover the darkness that we established in the previous step. So we're looking at doing the flat surfaces that are uppermost, maybe a slight curl around the edge to give it some transition. Looking at the established lines from the NULN oil, I'm very careful not to touch on those. And with that, the model is complete. The equipment's done up front. We've got the camouflage running over the whole chassis. The gunner is in position at the back, mounted on the MG42, as well as the MG42 that's mounted to the rear for crew. Inside you can see the back of the driver, just. And the wooden slats and everything work really nicely, so it came out really well. The dulled down tones of the camouflage suggest it's been in service for a while, but you can still see all the details such as the rivet lines, the door jambs and everything else. I really love the miniatures from this range. The Flames of War 15mm stuff has got super high detail levels when you consider the scale. This colour scheme has worked really well for me. I like how it pops on the board. I have quite a large Panzer Grenadier contingent, so I'll be adding more 251s, as well as the infantry that supports them. But for now, that's it. Thanks for joining me today for this episode. If you want to see more of the team's content, why not like, subscribe, and hit that bell. As for me, I guess it's time to grab a fresh cup of tea. But more importantly, keep painting those minis, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.